Termo to Madeline, audio edition, page 285, chapter titled, Madeline Meadows Falling on Hard Times. Now, by the beginning of 1913, the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company was in trouble. As of then, the problems were not terribly serious, and most anyone would have assumed that a sale, a bond issue, or a refinancing package would have straightened everything out. Only a short 4 years later, however, things had gotten so serious that there was no hope left of saving it. Now, had the homesteaders, who usually didn't have enough money to get to Susanville more than once or twice a year, if they'd been able to make a trip to San Francisco or Chicago, where the directors and financiers of the company were, they would have seen that men as destitute as they were, men who had been wealthy only a few years previously. If the homesteaders, in their plight over not being able to make a living in Madeline, could have talked with the owners of the irrigation company, they would have seen what real problems were like. Possibly, they would have been a little more forgiving. And actually, by 1910, a problem had started to develop. J. Noble Jones had already used up all of his own capital before he started making arrangements to float a bond issue. This one mistake alone cost him his system. As it was, however, in the long run, it did everyone a favor. The system was destined to fail because regardless of the glowing government and engineers' reports, 1 acre-foot per acre was not sufficient water to irrigate the desert lands of the Madeline Plains. There was just not as much water in Tule Lake as everyone thought there was. Had J. Noble Jones obtained an issue of bonds, the whole mess would have literally drug on forever, and many more people would have been hurt financially. As it was, when the money was gone, it spelled a swift end to the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company. Everyone who had placed their faith in Uncle Sam's system of giveaway lands and irrigated pastures in the desert, headed for failure from the very beginning, could make a new start somewhere else and get on with business of making a living. Back in the summer of 1910, the company, unable to secure the needed bonds in San Francisco, had sent their representative, George E. Roberts, to Chicago to try to negotiate a bond sale there. But money had been close to Chicago since the previous March. Bond sales were dual, and irrigation bonds were especially in disfavor because of several Chicago banks and financiers were in financial trouble after many of the western irrigation projects had cost them more than planned. Mr. Roberts contacted all the Chicago banks and loan houses. At the Farwell Trust Company, Granger Farwell had told him that he did not feel the institution could swing the proposal that year. After 2 weeks of negotiations, however, Mr. Roberts finally procured a loan of $220,000 for the Madeline Meadows Company for them. The irrigation company was to pay 6% interest over the next 2 years, and a 5-cent per commission went to Mr. Roberts. The whole system went under mortgage to the Farwell Trust Company. Farwell still refused to float a bond issue at the time, but agreed to help the company manage its finances and issue $500,000 worth of bonds as soon as the conditions were favorable. Now, this loan made J. Noble Jones happy, as he has only asked Roberts to obtain $150,000. It went through on November 1st, 1910. The company managed to keep the monthly interest paid up until May 1st, 1912. But that was the last payment of any kind that was made. By then, every cent of the loan had been spent. C. A. Hurst, one of the company's directors, summed the situation up nicely when these words in a letter to Mr. Jones, quote, "You say drafts must be met, but you know how difficult it is to pay something with nothing," unquote. The company had cleared land with a huge traction engine that it owned for any settler that wanted it done. They had finished building 70 miles of canals and lateral ditches. They were delivering water to everyone who had contracted with them and was ready for it. The company had bought and owned over 9,000 acres of deeded land. Now, by September 1st, 1911, $130,000 had been spent on canal and ditch construction alone. Now the money was gone once again, and there was still much that Mr. Jones wanted to do. Many homesteaders had been put to work, but the company had no more money coming in. Those who were receiving water had found that poor crops lost to rabbits and initial expenses had left them with no money to pay for water. Those who were not ready for water, of course, were not paying for what they were not getting. But again, if they thought they had fallen on hard times, they should have checked with J. Noble Jones. By the beginning of 1913, he had serious, irreversible problems and was trying to unload the system on anyone who would buy it. In the year before the $220,000 note came due, the Farwell Trust Company had been insolvent. It went bankrupt and was taken over by the receivership of the Mercantile Trust Company of San Francisco. Now, back in 1910, Farwell had borrowed the $220,000 from the Continental and Commercial Trust and Savings Bank in Chicago and the Northwest Trust Company also of Chicago. So, when the note matured in November of 1912, J. Noble Jones found all of these companies breathing down his neck. To make things worse, with a note of that size, with the whole irrigation system under mortgage, the Farwell Trust Company had gained majority control of the board of directors of the Madeline Meadows Company. Due to this insolvency, they had steadfastly refused to issue any bonds. Now, J. Noble Jones was running himself ragged, trying to find someone to refinance the system, float a bond issue, or buy him out. Everything went into court. No one got any water except the people right at Madeline, who could just take what they wanted while all the big wills were in court. Jones contracted with an American company to bond the system for $600,000, and a British company examined it and agreed upon an $800,000 bond issue. But by the time all the arrangements were made, World War I had begun in Europe, bringing a financial depression that prevented both of them from fulfilling their engagement. Money simply could not be had for such projects. J. Noble Jones soon found that sales were just as hard to come by. In the latter part of January 1913, while the first skirmishes were being fought in courts, Lewis Hill, son of Jim Hill, the railroad king, came out to Madeline to look at the system. He was so close to buying that he called a meeting of the settlers and promised them all free seed for spring planting. The generally rumored price to be paid was $1,700,000. The settlers were excited. The Hills, who were looking into buying the NCO, were excited, and J. Noble Jones was excited. Then the whole thing fell through. The next prospective buyer in the summer of 1913 was Watson P. Davidson of St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, he owned a huge acreage of timber land in Oregon, and when he could not find anyone to go in with him to put together a financial package, it was decided to trade the Madeline Meadows system for a massive Oregon apple orchard that he owned. Now, Mr. Davidson had visions of building a creamery in Madeline and turn the area into a dairying community. He wanted the system in the worst way, but money was tight, and that deal fell through also. So Mr. Jones spent several months working with C.W. Nibley of Salt Lake City. He was a director of the Santa Fe Railroad, and rumor had it that he was financial manager of $100 million worth of assets owned by the Mormon Church. Again, Mr. Jones could not make a sale. By the fall of 1913, all the water contracts that Madeline Meadows Company had assigned to B.F. Lynip and Ulty McCabe had become delinquent. None of the homesteaders could or would pay. Now, Lynip asked those contracts be assigned back to the irrigation company, and he asked for new ones for himself and McCabe. Then he found that the new ones were just as worthless as the others he had had. By the time another year had gone by, he was getting very grumpy. He wanted his money immediately and told J. Noble Jones that, quote, excuses or promises will not suffice any longer, unquote. They may be did not suffice, but he did not get anything else either. So in the summer of 1915, he filed suit against the irrigation company also. That spring, another sale almost went through. W.A. Sadborn of W.A. Bradford of New York City, promoters of the railroads and huge western irrigation projects, had become interested in the Madeline Meadows. Their head engineer, H.L. Jackson of Addison, Kansas, was familiar with Lassen County, having worked on a project in Honey Lake Valley. He had provided a favorable report on Madeline, but the irrigation company records had gotten so badly disorganized over the last couple of years of irrigation that a complete search and reorganization had to be carried out. By the time that was finished, the financial community of Wall Street was even less prepared to handle such a project. And once again the deal fell through. By this time, Jones had to resort to leasing the land owned by the company to the highest bidder among the local stockmen. Dean Duke, who by 1915 was running the corporation ranch, leased all the company's holdings for grazing and domestic use of the water. The following year, regardless of the fact that Mr. Jones did not lease anything to a sheepman, he had to do that too. H. J. Fitz was running sheep by then and managed to get the lease. He agreed to provide a ditch rider for the irrigation system, but only if he could collect a fee from the users. In the spring of 1917, everything was in such confusion that nobody knew who had what. Fritz tried to get the lease from Jones and succeeded, but then he found that Lineup had a better hold on the situation than Jones did. Lineup had already leased everything to George Williams and had taken possession of it. Finally, Fritz leased the range around Tule Lake for his sheep by subrenting for Williams. As far as irrigation water was concerned, anyone who was getting any, and that amounted to the Paulsons, the Olsons, the Talbots, the Williams, the Borsmans, and a couple of others who were in close where they could control the situation, was stealing it. Even though they all owned water contracts, the whole system was so tied up in court that a court order had been handed down, barring anyone from taking water without prior approval of the court. Now, needless to say, any of the homesteaders who had made any payments on the contracts were furious. Those few who were close and could sneak up and open the valve to let water out of the Tule Lake as soon as the court-appointed officials closed it. The ones farther out were not getting any water, even though Tule Lake was full. Now, one time, in the wee hours of the morning, someone in the town of Madeline stepped out of their house to find the entire town flooded under a few inches of water. The ditch tender was immediately sent for to put a stop to the problem. There had been a big head of water coming out of the Bailey's Reservoir and coursing down the canal towards the Williams Ranch. Someone, probably a disgruntled settler, had gone to the diversion box above town and put the head gates in place to shut the water off going in both directions. In a matter of minutes, the entire head of water was running over the bank and down toward Madeline. Due to the late discovery of the situation, Madeline remained a mud hole for the next couple of days. In spite of all the problems, and even though most everyone had begun to see the handwriting on the wall, the United States Department of Interior still had faith in the project. In the summer of 1916, engineers were sent out to do a complete study of the Madeline Meadows system. The 12-page legal document that they produced had nothing but praise for it. They surveyed the lake and found more water than could be used up. They found all the previous surveys and reports adequate. In the end, the General Land Office in Washington decided upon only one criteria for final proof of the desert lands of Madeline. In order to obtain the patent on his desert homestead, the only thing required of the settler for final proof was a water contract with the Madeline Meadows Land and Irrigation Company. The contracts may have been worthless, but B.F. Lynip's dealings, but the United States government was willing to promote the farce a little farther. All right, next chapter titled The Last Ruckus with the Indians on page 291. We'll continue that next time.